War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 38, the Israeli War of Independence, or whatever you want to call it. This was the fairly recognized name up until the late 80s and the fall of the Soviet Union, so we will stick with that. You can call it the Palestine Civil War. That is hard to justify, seeing as how there was never a unified Arab-Jewish state. Rarely in history has context played such a key role in analyzing the final outcome. On paper, the Jews should have lost badly. They were subject to crushing arms embargoes. They were outnumbered by the Arabs in Palestine, never mind the armies of Iraq, Syria, Transjordan, and Egypt directly, with augmentation from forces as far away as Morocco. The Jordanian military was trained and led by British officers. The Arabs, equipped with planes, tanks, and artillery, which, with the exception of a handful of World War II surplus planes, the Jews had none. But ultimately, less than 3 years removed from the Holocaust, for the Jews, this fight was existential. They were willing to die. The Arabs went into this war with a sense of optionality, and their leadership only reinforced this. While the Arabs were willing to kill, they were not ready to die. And this, ultimately, was what made the difference in 1948. By April of 1948, the British had withdrawn almost all their forces, leaving their institutions and barracks largely to the Arabs. Both sides identified Jerusalem as the key city, the city of Solomon having the historical roots to the country back nearly 3,000 years. The old city was firmly in the grasp of the Jordanian military, overshadowing the one organized Palestinian militia, commanded by Abdul Qadir al-Husseini, part of the historically powerful al-Husseini clan. They and the Nashashibi clan competed before and after the mandate for leadership of the Arabs in Palestine. The Nashashibis favored a more conciliatory approach to both Zionism and the British. They worked with the Ottomans as well. Nashashibis and al-Husseinis continue to play a role in Palestinian politics today and remain the dominant clans. As Jerusalem and the hills surrounding it are not the best for agriculture, there were few Jewish settlements nearby. West Jerusalem was expanded by Jewish immigration and had a majority Jewish population of about 100,000. East Jerusalem, which comprised the Old City and the far more ancient settlements, was majority Arab. The Jews had to maintain the road from Tel Aviv on the west coast to West Jerusalem, as the Arabs wanted to besiege and isolate West Jerusalem to starve the Jews out. Dotted all along the road were Arab villages, which comprised the base of their strength. From the defenses there, they had complete control of the road. Starting in March, the Haganah tried to push hastily armored trucks, to little effect and huge losses. The village militias of al-Husseini were holding the road. The Israelis devised Operation Nashon, fittingly named after the first man to step into the Red Sea after Moses had parted it. Instead of forcing the road, the key villages would be attacked and seized. The Haganah, Irgun, and Lehi would all work together. From 5 to 20 April, nearly 1,500 men from the various Jewish militias were part of this effort. During the fighting, Abdul al-Husseini died during a night recon. Nearly a dozen Arab villages were cleared out, and it was during this operation that Deir Yassin was taken to much controversy that was to have disproportionate impact on the war. Deir Yassin was an Arab village of about 600, 3 miles west of Jerusalem. Deir, which means monastery, was built originally by the Knights Hospitallers. After a loudspeaker implored the citizens to evacuate immediately, the assault started with mostly Lehi and Irgun, and this was their first operation as infantry, and the results show. Dozens of Jews were wounded in the initial assault, with the commander killed and his deputy wounded. The initial force took 30% casualties. After the initial failure, the Haganah and its strike unit, the Palmach, reinforced with mortars, allowing them to seize the village. In total, 5 Irgun members were killed in the attack. The village surrendered, and approximately 110 Arabs were killed, undoubtedly some of them prisoners. The unified Jewish forces claimed the deaths were from the use of explosives, but the evidence doesn't seem to support this. The sturdy stone houses would need far more explosives than they were carrying. The surviving Arabs either fled or were taken away by trucks. The one Palestinian Arab leader died on 8 April. The next day, Deir Yassin was captured with unquestionably civilian deaths and executed prisoners. This double shot of bad news created a panic in the local Arab population. And, as with all things in war, this confusion led to exaggerations. The Arabs claimed hundreds of civilians were murdered, most of them women and children. They begged the British to intervene. As the Jewish forces controlled the village, there was no means for independent verification of what happened. The Haganah was united with the Arabs to play up what happened. Ben-Gurion, while happy to have access to Lehi and Irgun forces, was always looking with an eye towards the post-war future and his undisputed role in leading it. As the days went on, the hysterics were only amplified. Accusations of rape and mutilation were rife and spread, which even local Arabs who lived there denied at the time. The best explanation is that the Arabs had suffered two massive losses in 2 days, and they hoped by exaggerating what happened, they would get the British and or outside Arabs to intervene. What ended up happening is the terror, real or imagined, that Deir Yassin invoked caused a mass panic of local Arabs who fled before the smallest Jewish advance. During the operations to open the road to Jerusalem, twice villages taken by Jewish forces were expelled by what British army forces remained. But over a dozen Arab villages were seized, often changing hands several times, highlighting the weakness of both Jewish and Arab forces. While both could mass a few hundred fighters to seize a village, they could not maintain a garrison, and, after Deir Yassin, local villagers refused to take up arms, leaving it to the disorganized militia once led by the now-dead al-Husseini that, by May, had effectively ceased to exist. Outside of this critical fight for Jerusalem, the Jewish strategy was simple: retreat nowhere and expand where possible. The overall Israeli plan was called Dalit, and there is some debate as to what the overall objective is, whether defensive or offensive. What actually happened is what matters. The initial partition proposed by the UN defaulted to Arab control of unoccupied land, primarily in the Negev. The areas remaining under Jewish control were often isolated and indefensible. The Arab rhetoric, openly promising to finish what Hitler had started, only strengthened both Jewish resolve and disregard for international opinion. The Jews felt isolated, threatened, and ultimately having nowhere to retreat. With the defeat of the local Palestinian Arabs, the surrounding Arab countries united in the Arab League, who only waited for the formal end of British occupation on May 14th. United is a relative term. They were united in eliminating the Jewish presence. What would remain was debatable. The Iraqis, Syrians, and Lebanese were all keen on taking control of the fertile Galilee. Jordan's King Abdullah wanted to unite both east and west of the Jordan into one nation. King Farouk of Egypt was more interested in ensuring King Abdullah did not unite Palestine, but rather saw a division with southern Palestine, with Gaza, the Negev, and the coastal strip to Jaffa and Tel Aviv being absorbed into Egypt. In pronouncements, public and private, the ability of the Jews to defend themselves and the idea of a unified independent Palestinian state were disregarded uniformly by the various members of the Arab League. On paper, the Egyptian and Jordanian armies were roughly equal in terms of manpower and equipment. In practice, the Jordanians were better led and had the huge advantage of being able to occupy the West Bank territories in Judea to the south and Samaria to the north. King Abdullah supported partition because he assumed, correctly in retrospect, that those territories allocated to the Arabs would become part of Jordan, and, in fact, he negotiated with Ben-Gurion to ensure his powerful army would remain in the Arab territories and not move to the Jewish allocated areas. In all assessments, except the Israeli one, the nascent Israeli army was given no chance at defeating the combined Arab armies. As the British flag descended, the Israeli flag took its place, and the region of Palestine disappeared from the maps. A simultaneous attack from north, south, and east took place the next day. In the south, the Egyptians drove north. They had freedom to maneuver in the sparsely populated arid desert, but they were incessantly incapable of defeating what few Israeli settlements they could find. A notable example was at Yad Mordechai, where 100 Israelis, armed with rifles and a single machine gun, held up 2,500 Egyptians with armor, artillery, and aviation support for 5 days before they evacuated with few losses. The next day, the Egyptians, unaware of the evacuation, shelled the town for several hours before walking in unopposed. This delay allowed the IDF time to reinforce other key points in the south, which would effectively wear down the Egyptian army quickly. 12 miles north of Gaza, the Egyptians reached Ashdod, only 20 miles from Tel Aviv. But having suffered delays and surprising resistance from the IDF settlements, they could go no further. Their attack culminated after less than 2 weeks. Now the Israelis took the offensive. One of the interesting points about this war is the Israelis got stronger as the war went on. When the British Mandate ended, all the Jews in camps on Cyprus and elsewhere, many of them young men, were now free to enter Israel. They were immediately placed under arms. And, while the region was technically under an arms embargo, the Czechoslovakians were supplying guns and Messerschmitt copies to Israel. The air attacks shocked the Egyptian military. The Egyptians' sole true victory happened at the Battle of Nitzanim, south of the Stall at Ashdod. The static Egyptians were able to consolidate their firepower and over the course of several days reduce the defenses with 30 various artillery pieces and several tanks, versus the Israeli single mortar and 4 Bren machine guns. After 2 days of shelling and 50 killed, with half that number wounded, the remaining 104 soldiers and local villagers surrendered to the Egyptian army. The Egyptian pressure to the south caused the evacuation of some central defenses around Jerusalem. While Jerusalem was the spiritual heart of Judaism, Tel Aviv on the coast was its most important city. The secular Zionist leaders were forced to a pragmatic compromise to ensure Tel Aviv's safety. Dominating the hills and roads into Jerusalem was the fortress of Latrun, 15 miles west of Jerusalem. Israelis controlled it initially, but evacuated it to reinforce the south. The Jordanian army quickly seized it and used it to again cut off supplies from Tel Aviv into Jerusalem. The Israelis tried to retake it to relatively large losses. Jordan's military quickly occupied the Old City and eastern Jerusalem with a massive artillery barrage. The 1,500 Jews in the Jewish quarter of the Old City were expelled under Arab League protection. The hardest fighting was in and around Jerusalem, where the defenders maintained the advantage. The Syrian and Iraqi advances to the north failed utterly. They had assumed the Jews could not and would not fight, and at the smallest amount of resistance, the poorly led Arabs simply stopped. A truce was declared on 11 June for 30 days, as the Egyptians, Israelis, Syrians, and Iraqis were exhausted, either physically or morally, and the Jordanians had conquered what they came for. They had Jerusalem and the West Bank. The Israelis used these scant 4 weeks to nearly double the size of their army, with a fresh influx of refugees previously held by the British, to nearly 65,000. The weapons flooded in from Czechoslovakia, and the held defenses reinforced. The Arabs continued to bicker over who would control now Israeli territory, and spent more time planning the operations of their allies than their own forces. The truce ended when Egypt attacked the settlement at Nekba, which was soundly defeated, and crushed the morale of the Egyptian military. The Israelis continued to try and open the road to Jerusalem, and failed, to heavy losses. They eventually cut a rough trail bypassing the Jordanian-held defenses that allowed in some supplies and critically water, which had been cut off. In the north, the IDF expelled many Syrian and Iraqi defended locations with heavy losses on both sides, but with mostly IDF victories in Operation Dekel, which was led by the Canadian Ben Dunkelman and secured the entire lower Galilee from Haifa to the Sea of Galilee. With this, the second, longer truce from July to October was declared, which allowed both sides to prepare defenses and, for the Israelis, plan offensives. The offensive spirit in the Arab armies was completely crushed, which left the various members of the Arab League only hoping to hold what they had. The Jordanians had the strongest positions, with the strongest armies, in areas almost entirely inhabited by Arabs. The Israelis knew there was little they could do about Transjordan's West Bank. When the truce ended in October, the Israelis attacked in the north and south. Starting in the south, the sparsely populated Negev was easily cleared. The Egyptians' poor defense had no depth, and at the earliest penetration, the surrounded Egyptian defenses fled. Ultimately, the Israelis penetrated deep into the Sinai, taking the key position of Abu Agela, and completely surrounded the Gaza Strip, with Gaza, Rafah, and Khan Yunis in Egyptian hands. They seized the Negev in a southern line stretching from Rafah to the northern tip of the Gulf of Aqaba, giving access to the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. To the north, the Israelis were able to expel the Syrian and Iraqi forces who, at times, put up solid defenses, but once isolated or bypassed, were easily compelled to retreat. Arab villages which resisted the IDF were evacuated and depopulated. Those that didn't resist were left alone. This policy made local Palestinian Arab resistance scant. The First Arab-Israeli War is small in scale, but massive in details and nuance. Few operations exceeded more than a few thousand combatants on either side, with the majority being in the couple of hundreds. But it set the framework for the next 80 years. It highlighted a clash of not just armies, but cultures. The fatalistic and prone to hyperbole Arab culture, with the brutally honest and hyper-rationalist now Israeli culture. The context of the post-World War II era is unquestionably dominant. Despite the horrors of World War II, the Arab world, while not immune, was largely on the sidelines. The North African fighting was done by European powers, the Levant and Arabia unmolested by the global conflict. The Jews, on the other hand, suffered more than any, comparatively. Arab boasts of eradicating the Jews, which could be seen as just talk, was not taken as such by the Jewish fighters. Likewise, the initial losses after shrugging off any idea of Jewish resistance caused fatalistic abandonment of objectives in the name of Inshallah. At the end, the Israelis were forced to withdraw from positions in the Sinai, while no Arab military was likewise compelled by international agreement. The term Nakba, meaning catastrophe, was not initially assigned to the plight of the locally dispossessed Arabs. Rather, it referenced the abject humiliation of the combined Arab countries. This humiliation of the ruling monarchical families was the reason for the various coups and overthrows leading to pan-Arabist nationalism and the rise of the Ba'athist parties. Only Transjordan's Hashemites survived, and just barely. At the end, there was no inkling of an independent Palestinian Arab state. Rather, the desire for the surrounding Arab countries to avenge their humiliation and eradicate the fledgling Jewish nation. The charismatic Gamal Nasser trying to do so only 8 years later, during the Suez Crisis, which we will discuss next week. Thanks for joining us today. If you liked what you heard, please like, subscribe, rate, and comment. Most importantly, share with your friends. Join the conversation at the War 102 subreddit, and check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for links to more information and supporting videos. Send me an email at war102podcast@gmail.com. I look forward to your comments and hope you join us again next week. See you then.